There is a hotel in the mountains of northern Vermont that has exactly one rule. Nobody prints it on a card. Nobody buries it in an email. It's spoken out loud, every time, by whoever is standing behind the desk. Once your door is closed for the night, do not open it again, no matter what you hear, no matter who calls your name. Most guests smile. A few laugh. One reviewer online called it a fun gimmick. 3 stars. Loved the pancakes. She didn't leave a second review. There wasn't a second visit. What happened over 11 nights in late October has never been fully explained. Not by the sheriff. Not by the family who's owned that building for 4 generations. Not by the 2 guests who lived through the worst of it, who still, to this day, won't say what they saw in that hallway. This is the story of the rule, and of the first person who decided it didn't apply to her. Maren Cole was 34, and she made her living finding places other people missed. Her blog had 40,000 readers who trusted her word on remote lodges and forgotten motels. She had one rule of her own: never write about a place you haven't slept in alone. That rule was about to cost her more than she knew. She found the listing on an obscure Vermont travel forum, posted by someone calling themselves Old Roads_VD. Grainy photos. A 3-story Victorian at the end of a dead-end gravel road. Nothing else around for 2 miles. The post wasn't a recommendation, exactly. More like a warning dressed up as one. Great place if you don't mind rules. They only have the one. Follow it. Maren called ahead. The man who answered, Walter Averill, said the rule before she'd even asked her first question. Flat voice. Practiced. Like he'd said it 1,000 times and stopped caring whether anyone believed him. Is that a safety thing? She asked. Wildlife. The pause on the line lasted long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Something like that, he said. You still want the room? She did. Before she left, she texted her sister, the only family she had left since their mother passed years earlier, letting her know she'd be off the grid for a few days. Her sister sent back a single word, creepy, followed by a laughing emoji. Maren laughed too, typed back something dismissive about good content, and didn't think about the exchange again until it was far too late to matter. The drive up took 3 hours, the last 20 minutes on gravel that hugged a reservoir gone flat and silver under a dying sun. Walter met her on the porch before she'd reached the steps, like he'd been watching. 60-something. Weathered. A handshake that ended fast, on purpose. You're the only one here this week, he said. Slow season. He walked her through check-in quick. Room 3, 2nd floor. Breakfast at 8. And then, handing her an old brass key heavier than it looked, he said it again. Once your door is closed for the night, don't open it. No matter what you hear. No matter who calls your name. What happens if I do? He looked at her for a second too long. Nobody's ever told me, he said. The ones who opened it didn't stick around to explain. He didn't laugh. Neither did she, not really. He nodded toward the stairs and disappeared behind the desk, and she didn't see him again until dinner, where the conversation went nowhere past the weather and the drive. By 11, she was in her room, door shut, the old iron latch clicking home behind her like a period at the end of a sentence. She had no idea it was the last ordinary hour of her life. A little after midnight, footsteps in the hallway. Slow, unhurried. She checked her phone. 12:14. No signal, just a clock and a battery percentage ticking forward in the dark. Walter, she told herself. Checking locks. The steps past her door, faded near the stairs, didn't come back. She was asleep again in 20 minutes. The second time she woke, she knew before she was even fully conscious that something had changed. The footsteps had stopped outside her door. 3 knocks. Soft, evenly spaced. Maren. Her name, from the hallway. A voice she didn't know. Female, maybe, though the cadence was wrong, stretched slightly, like a recording slowed down just enough to notice. Maren, can you let me in? I think I'm locked out of my room. Every decent instinct, she had told her to get up. Someone's in trouble. Someone needs help. That instinct is wired deep, and overriding it feels almost physically wrong. She stayed in bed. She remembered Walter's face. The knock came again, harder. Maren, I know you're awake. I can hear you breathing." That sentence did something to her fear that she never fully found words for. It wasn't the voice of someone who needed help. It was the voice of something that already knew far more about her than a stranger in a hallway should. It tried for almost an hour. It knew her sister's name. It knew the name of a dog she'd had at 9 years old. Small, private things that had no business floating around outside her door at 2 in the morning. Then, a little after 3, it stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the voice had been. She sat up until gray light bled around the curtains, and only then did exhaustion finally take her under. She came downstairs hollow-eyed. Walter took one look at her and set the coffee pot down. "You heard it," he said. Not a question. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away, and when he finally spoke, he gave her almost nothing. "I don't know," he said. "Nobody in my family has ever known. Not really. There's an old story about the land this place sits on. A fire a long time back. A girl who didn't get out." He shook his head. "I don't tell that story anymore. People go looking for it, and looking makes it worse. All I know for certain, in 130 years, is that the door has never failed anybody who kept it shut." Marin wanted more. He wouldn't give it to her. "Then why keep this place open?" she asked. "Why not tear it down?" "Because it works," Walter said simply. "As long as that door stays shut." She decided she was done. Not curious anymore. Not chasing a story anymore. Just done. She packed her bag with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. She thanked Walter in a voice that came out thinner than she meant it to. She pulled out of the gravel lot a little before 10 in the morning, already composing the apologetic cancellation message she'd send her editor once she had signal again. The road back followed the reservoir for what she remembered from the drive-in, as roughly 15 minutes before it met the 2-lane highway toward town. She drove it in 12, watching the water flash silver through the trees on her right, exactly where it should have been. At what should have been the highway junction, there was no highway, just more gravel, curving left along water that was, impossibly, still on her right. She told herself she'd missed a fork. She turned around, drove back the way she'd come, watching for a turn she'd somehow overlooked. 11 minutes later, the lodge's dark green shutters came into view through the trees, exactly where she'd left them, as though she had simply driven in a wide, patient circle without ever once seeing a place to turn. She sat in the gravel lot with the engine running for a long time before she made herself get out. Walter didn't look surprised to see her. That, more than anything, was what frightened her most. "Some folks find their way out just fine after the first night," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Some don't. I've never worked out what decides it. I'm sorry. I should have told you that road doesn't always cooperate. I didn't want to scare you off before you'd even checked in. So I'm stuck here. For tonight, looks like," Walter said. "Try again tomorrow. It's usually just the once." Usually. She didn't like the shape of that word at all, but there was nothing to do with it except carry her bag back up the stairs to room 3 and sit with the fact that whatever had spoken through her door the night before now had one more night to try again. That afternoon, restless and unwilling to simply wait in her room, she drove the loop a second time in daylight, this time recording the entire drive on her phone, certain that if the road was doing something impossible, a video would prove it one way or the other. It didn't. When she played it back that evening, the video showed exactly what she remembered seeing with her own eyes: reservoir, trees, gravel curving on and on. Except for one detail she hadn't noticed while driving. At the 9-minute mark, for 11 consecutive seconds, her own voice on the recording said something she had no memory of saying out loud, in a tone flatter and calmer than her own. "Almost home," the recording said, in her voice, while the dashboard camera showed nothing but empty road ahead of her. She never found out who or what that comment was addressed to. She made herself drive into town anyway, telling herself the loop was some quirk of the road she didn't understand and didn't need to. On the way, she passed a small brick building with a hand-lettered sign out front, the County Historical Society, and something in her, some restless need to put a name to whatever was happening to her, made her pull over. A retired librarian named Doris let her in. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She set a thin folder on the counter, water-stained, older than it looked, and slid it across without a word. Inside was a single photocopied newspaper column from 1889. A fire, a house, a family named Renner, a daughter who never made it out. Marin read it standing up, twice, before she could make herself ask the only question that mattered. Was there ever a rule? Back when it was the Renner house. Doris's expression changed, just slightly. Funny you asked that, she said. She didn't elaborate. She only turned the photocopy over, tapped one line near the bottom with a single finger, and let Marin read it herself. The line was short, a second-hand account, unverified, from a neighbor. It said the girl's father used to warn people not to answer if she called through a closed door at night. It said it wasn't always her voice that came out when she asked to be let in. Marin didn't ask anything else. She thanked Doris, folded the photocopy into her jacket, and left before the librarian could offer to talk about it further. One detail followed her back to the lodge and wouldn't let go. A witness at the time had claimed to hear the girl's voice from inside the burning house. Not screaming, calling names. Names of people who weren't even there that night. Marin sat in her car in the gravel lot for 20 minutes before she went back inside. That evening, something small and strange happened, and she almost didn't mention it to Walter at all. She'd set her phone to record audio in her jacket pocket during dinner, an old habit, background noise for later editing. When she played it back afterward, there were 4 full minutes missing from the middle of the file. Not silent, missing. The timestamp jumped clean from 6:41 to 6:45 like the recorder itself had blinked. She didn't tell Walter. She told herself it was a glitch. That night, she didn't try to sleep. She sat up with every lamp on, recorder running on the nightstand, telling herself that doing something was better than doing nothing. At 12:31, the footsteps returned. This time there was no knock first. The voice started immediately, and the softness from the night before was gone. Marin, open the door. Not a request, an instruction. You went and talked to Doris, it said, conversational, almost amused. You went digging through my business. That wasn't very polite. Marin's blood went cold. There was no way, none, that anything outside that door should have known where she'd spent her afternoon. I just want to explain, it said, softer now, and that was worse than the anger. Nobody's ever let me explain. Open the door, just for a second. I'll show you what really happened. She said nothing. She didn't move. The doorknob turned. Slowly. A quarter turn, the old brass mechanism groaning under pressure that shouldn't have existed, because the lock held, because Walter had shown her the iron bolt himself, a lock that had never once failed in over 100 years. It strained there a long moment. Testing. Then it eased back to center and went still. Silence swallowed the hallway. A different kind of silence than before. Thicker. Marin counted her own breaths to fill it, and somewhere around the 40th breath, she let herself believe it was over. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened at all. No footsteps, no voice, just the ordinary creak of an old building settling into a cold October night. Her shoulders dropped for the first time in hours. She almost laughed, the shaky, relieved kind of laugh that comes after real fear finally lets go. That was the mistake. Because the bedside clock, an old wind-up model Walter had left for guests without cell service, had stopped. Not run down. Stopped clean, both hands frozen at 1:13, in a room where every other sign of time, her own racing pulse, the graying edge of exhaustion behind her eyes, insisted far more than an hour had passed since she'd last checked it. She wound the little brass key at its back, felt it catch and turn exactly the way a working mechanism should. It still didn't move. Then she noticed the shadow under the door. It hadn't been there a moment ago. A dark, unbroken line pressed flush against the gap at the bottom of the door, the shape of someone standing directly on the other side, close enough that no light came through at all. It hadn't knocked. It hadn't spoken. It was simply there, waiting, The way something waits when it already knows exactly how long you're capable of holding still. Marin didn't move. She watched that shadow for what felt like an hour and was, according to the stopped clock, no time at all. Then, in the mirror across the room, angled just enough to catch the edge of the bed, she saw something that made the breath stop in her throat all over again. Her own reflection was a half-second behind her. Not wrong, just late, the way a bad video call lags a beat behind the person speaking. She lifted her hand to check. The reflection lifted its hand after she had already lowered hers. She looked away. She did not look at the mirror again. When she finally worked up the nerve to check the gap under the door a second time, the shadow was gone. No footsteps had announced its leaving. It had simply stopped being there, the same way it had simply started. The clock read 1:13 for the rest of the night. She checked it 4 more times before dawn, and it never moved. Not once. Not even after the gray light finally came up and the mirror, when she dared it, was keeping perfect time with her again, as if none of it had happened at all. She told herself, in that gray light, that it had been exhaustion. A trick of tired eyes and old machinery. She wanted very badly to believe that. Walter didn't have much to say to her that second morning. He looked at her, looked at the dark circles under her eyes, and simply nodded, like a man confirming something he already expected. The lock held, he said. It tried the knob, Marin said. Did anyone ever tell you that? That it actually tries the door? Something shifted behind Walter's eyes. Just slightly. Just enough. No, he said quietly. Nobody's ever told me that before. He didn't explain what that meant. He didn't offer anything more. And something about the way he said it, careful, guarded, like a man deciding in real time how much to keep to himself, told Marin that Walter Averill knew more than he had ever let on, to her or possibly to anyone. She almost left that morning. She had the car packed, the key on the desk, her hand actually on the door handle, when Walter got called into the back by a delivery at the kitchen door. He left the guest ledger open on the front desk. Old habit, she guessed. Nothing he'd ever worried about hiding. Marin told herself not to look. She looked anyway. She flipped back through the pages without any real plan, just a nervous need to keep her hands busy, decades of names sliding past under her thumb. Somewhere in the early 90s, her hand stopped on its own, before the rest of her had caught up. A single line. October, 31 years back. Room 3. The handwriting stopped her cold before she even read the name attached to it. She'd know that handwriting anywhere. The particular slant of the capital letters. The way the loop on the lowercase g never quite closed. She'd spent a year of her life reading it on birthday cards and grocery lists and the backs of old photographs, going through a box of her mother's things after the funeral. The name beside it wasn't Cole. It was her mother's maiden name, the one she'd stopped using the year she got married, the one Marin had only ever seen written down a handful of times in her life. In the margin beside it, in different ink, in handwriting that wasn't her mother's at all, someone had written 2 words. Little Bird. Marin was still staring at the page when Walter came back through the kitchen door, and whatever was on her face made him stop mid-step. He didn't ask what she'd found. He simply looked at the open ledger, then at her, and went the color of old paper. You should put that away, he said, very quietly. Please. That's my mother's name, Marin said. Walter, why is my mother's name in this book? He didn't answer. He closed the ledger himself, gently, like it might bruise. I didn't know, he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he sounded genuinely frightened, not of her, of something else entirely. I swear to you, I didn't know that name was in there until just now. He wouldn't say anything else. He wouldn't meet her eyes again for the rest of that morning. She stayed, not out of curiosity anymore, because leaving, suddenly, felt like walking away from the one answer that might actually matter. The second night started the way the first had. Familiar footsteps. Familiar knock. Marin told herself that was almost comforting, in a terrible way. 20 minutes in, the voice said something it hadn't said before. Something that had no business coming from anywhere but inside her own skull. or from the margin of a ledger she'd only just closed that morning. It used her mother's nickname for her, a word Marin hadn't heard spoken aloud since she was 11, the summer her mother died. A private word. It existed nowhere. Not in an email, not in an old journal, not in any interview she'd ever given about her work. She had never once said it out loud to another living person, because saying it out loud had always felt like breaking something. "I know you, little bird," the voice said, gentle as a lullaby. Marin pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from making a sound. She thought of the ledger. 31 years of ink between that entry and this one. Her mother had stood exactly where Marin was standing now, had heard, maybe, this exact same voice, using this exact same word, and had never once told her daughter a single thing about it. Whatever was in that hallway didn't need to break down a door to get to you. It had already found a door on the inside, a long time ago, through someone who never got the chance to warn her. The knob turned again that night, longer this time. It held its strain for nearly a full minute before releasing. In the stillness that followed, Marin heard something faint on the other side of the wood, something that might have been laughter or might have been someone crying, pitched so low and strange she was never able to decide which. By the time gray light came up, she had not slept at all. Some fundamental piece of her certainty, the quiet, unspoken belief that she was simply an observer in someone else's old story, had come apart completely. She left that afternoon. She told herself she wasn't coming back. She didn't write about the lodge for 3 months. When she finally published the story, she changed the names, blurred the location, and left out 2 things entirely: the doorknob and the mirror. She told herself it was for the reader's sake, that it would read like fiction otherwise. The truth was simpler. Writing it down felt like giving it a permanence she wasn't ready to grant. Nearly 2 years later, a reader from Massachusetts sent her a message that stopped her cold on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The woman had stayed at the lodge the previous fall, drawn there by Marin's own carefully sanitized post. She'd heard the footsteps, heard the voice at her door, made it through the night exactly the way Marin had. On her way out, checking out at the desk, she glanced into the old leather guest ledger while Walter was in the back. Curiosity, nothing more. Marin's name was there, from 2 Octobers before, exactly as she remembered signing it. And directly beneath it, in the same ledger, same week, was a second name. A name Marin had never told a living soul, because she had never registered as anyone but herself. The name in the ledger, in handwriting that matched neither Walter's block print nor Marin's own, read simply, Eleanor R., Room 3. Nobody has ever explained how that got there. Not Walter, not the woman from Massachusetts, not anyone Marin has asked since. When Marin finally called Walter about it, he was quiet for a long time. "I stopped looking at that ledger a long time ago," he said. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't either." Then he said one more thing, almost too quiet to catch, before he hung up. "You should know, that's not the only name that's ever shown up in there that shouldn't be. And it isn't always the same name, either." Marin asked what he meant by that. He didn't answer. The line just went quiet, and then it went dead, and when she called back 20 minutes later, it rang 11 times before going to a voicemail box that had never once, in 2 years of occasional calls, accepted a new message. She has never gotten through to him since. Out of habit, more than hope, she still checks the number every few months, always late at night, always alone. It rings the same 11 times, every time, before the same dead voicemail box picks up. She has never once heard it ring 12. There's one more detail Marin has never published anywhere, never told her sister, never said out loud to anyone but the woman from Massachusetts. In a single late-night message neither of them has spoken of again. It's a small thing. It might mean nothing at all. The word the voice used for her that second night, the private nickname, the one that existed nowhere outside her own memory, is a word Marin has never once heard again since leaving that lodge. Except in her own head, late at night, in her mother's voice. She still can't decide if that's a comfort or the worst part of the entire story. There's a reason this story starts with 11 nights, and not 2. 3 years after Marin's visit, a small production crew, for people making a low-budget documentary about roadside curiosities, booked the lodge for what was supposed to be a single overnight shoot. They ended up staying 11 nights instead, snowed into the valley by an early storm that closed the only road out for almost 2 weeks. Only 2 of them came home. What happened during those 11 nights has never made it into any documentary, finished or otherwise. The 2 survivors gave one joint statement to the county sheriff, sealed at their own request, and have declined, consistently and completely, every single interview request since, including 3 from Marin herself, sent over the course of a year, none of which were ever answered. Walter closed the lodge to new bookings not long after. He never explained why, and by the time Marin tried to reach him again, the number had been disconnected altogether. The Averill Point Lodge is still standing at the end of that gravel road, even now, even closed. For over a century, it operated on exactly one rule, spoken word for word by whichever Averill was behind the desk, and as far as anyone has ever been able to confirm, every guest who honored it walked out the front door the next morning, tired, rattled, but out. What happens to the ones who don't is a question nobody there has ever been able to answer, because nobody has ever stayed long enough to find out. The door, when they check the room the next day, is always open from the inside. No sign of where the guest went. No sign of forced entry. Just an open door and a silence that nobody at that lodge has ever learned to explain. So if you ever find yourself on a quiet road in the mountains, and a stranger behind an old desk tells you there's just the one rule, that your door stays shut no matter what you hear, no matter who calls your name, you might want to remember Marin Cole. And you might want to ask yourself how many other names are sitting in that ledger, right now, that shouldn't be there at all. There is one last thing worth mentioning, small enough that Marin almost left it out entirely. The forum post that started all of this, the one from a user called oldroads_VT, the one that first put the Averill Point Lodge in front of her. She went looking for it again, months later, wanting to credit the original poster in her article. The thread was gone. Not deleted, not archived under a new title. The forum's own records showed no account by that name had ever existed, and no thread matching that title had ever been posted, on any date, by anyone. She still has the screenshot she took that first afternoon, the one that sent her driving 3 hours into the mountains in the first place. She has never been able to explain where it came from, or who wrote the words on it, or why. Of everyone browsing that forum that week, it found its way specifically to her, at exactly the moment she happened to be looking for somewhere new. What do you think is really happening at room 3, and who else's name is hiding in that book? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if stories like this one keep you up in the best way, subscribe for more.